Welcome, everybody. As you can tell, we have a dear friend of the Aspen Institute, a close advisor to all of what we do, somebody who's helped the Aspen Institute in particular with upskilling the American workforce, with things like career and technical education, and then community college work. When you came out of Chicago, you had all sorts of ideas. I hope we've executed on them. Please welcome the Commerce Secretary of the United States, Penny Pritzker. You've been in charge of the digital economy. You're the new Commerce Secretary who gets to bring us into the transition. Tell us exactly how you focus on a digital economy and make sure everybody gets included in its benefits.
Well, first of all, when we think about the digital economy, you have to step back and say it's pretty extraordinary what's happened. 10 years ago, I think 20% of the world had access to the digital economy. Today, you've got about 3.2 million people, 3.2 billion people online, and by 2020, that number will be 5 billion. And what's important is how do we make sure that folks have, access? And so the way that the Department of Commerce has engaged with the digital economy is in a number of ways. First of all, for the very first time, we put together a group called the Digital Economy Leadership Team, which are folks from across the department who bring expertise in everything from how do we make sure that companies have an opportunity to sell their digital products around the world, or how do we use data and things like that. So we've really brought together a really good group of folks so that we can craft good policy.
But before you go on, tell me what you mean by digital economy, because even the coffee I drink is probably now has more digital content.
The digital economy is everything, right? What we're focused on is a number of issues. First, the policy issues that we think about are, first is making sure that we have a free and open internet. Because, as you pointed out, every business, every government, all of us are living online now. We take for granted the idea that we have a free and open internet, but it's actually being severely challenged, and we can talk about that more. The second issue that we focus on is trust online. And so you use products and services online because you have a certain amount of trust in them. But there's a lot of issues that are being raised about privacy, security, encryption, and that's where we would get involved. The third area is access. We still have 34 million Americans who do not have access to high-speed internet. So that's a big problem because education today and workforce training and communication and how we get our news and everything we do now has a digital component, and that's only going to be more so. So making sure that the United States, where everyone has access to high-speed internet, is really important. And then finally, we're working with companies in the most cutting-edge technologies to work with them about what are the policies, whether it's drones or artificial intelligence or autonomous vehicles, et cetera, all the things.
Well, let's unpack these one at a time. Your first one was free and open, and you said to me, you don't know all the ways that's being attacked these days. So tell me what threats there are to the free and open internet and what you're doing.
Well, we have governments around the world that are trying to basically restrict access to the internet by either, and you see it in China. You have the Great Wall of China, the Great Digital Wall of China that is restricting access to content. There's restrictions in terms of data localization. There's using regulations as mechanisms for restricting your ability to sell your digital goods or services around the world. And digital goods and services are our fastest growing service export. And so it's something that we at the Department of Commerce are very focused on, working to fight these forces. In fact, we were just, the OECD just had a meeting this week in Mexico focused on precisely this challenge, which is the free and open internet is being potentially fragmentized, and the other threat is that it could be taken over by governments, which is not what we want. And that's, in fact, something that we've been working on.
But you talk about it overseas. Are there any threats to the free and open internet here in the United States if certain corporations don't allow pure net neutrality?
Well, net neutrality is being implemented now. And so I think that isn't the biggest challenge we face. I think the challenge that we face are these questions of trust and what's happening. Someone told me in the last couple of days there's been more money stolen online than there has in bank robberies, which is easy to imagine today, given that banks are hard to rob,
Right.
if you will.
I haven't heard of a bank robbery recently.
Exactly. But the point being is that it's not just money online, it's also the issue of, so for example, this challenge between encryption and lawful access to equipment, whether it's phones or iPads or things like that, is really, it's another challenge that we're facing as it relates to the digital economy. I mean, we're really at the beginning of these tools being ubiquitous, and they're only going to be more so with the Internet of Things, where there's more information available about all of us online than I think any of us are really fully aware of. I don't mean your Google search. I'm talking about the ability to get at our personal information and then to use it for nefarious purposes. And so this whole set of issues is something that we at the Department of Commerce are, central in the federal government working on.
Well, you just mentioned the security one, and obviously they're not bank robberies, but every day, millions of dollars are spent by banks and everybody else trying to protect things. People break in, people hack into people's accounts. Is there a way to make a more secure network that really has authentication built into it more? And is the Commerce Department looking into that?
Yes, so one of the things that cybersecurity is a very big issue that we're focused on. And the president issued his cybersecurity national action plan. And part of that was creating a commission, which we at the Department of Commerce serve as the secretariat for. Tom Donilon, the former national security advisor, and Sam Palmisano are running this commission of 12 experts to really lay out a plan, frankly, for the next administration as to what's the next evolution of cybersecurity for our country. I think it's the number one threat that we have to not just commerce, but to our country writ large. And it's moving, the sophistication is moving extremely quickly. And so we, at the Department of Commerce, work closely with Department of Homeland Security on cybersecurity. But frankly, any of you who are running businesses, you know how many times you're being, attacked per day, per hour. It's extraordinary. And the reality is, given the interconnectivity of all of us. So if you think about the Target breach came through the HVAC contractor, right? Of 80 million people's personal information. I mean, this means the private sector and the public sector have got to work closely together on cybersecurity. The solutions, the other reason we have to work closely together is not just because the solutions are really probably going to come from the private sector as much as from anywhere, but also so much of our critical infrastructure is in private sector hands. It's not in the public sector hands. And so if you think about our electricity, our electrical grid, if you think about there are dams that are public dams, but there are private sector dams that are controlled by the private sector. And so we've got to create mechanisms where we're working more closely together, which we are.
Are there any game-changing technologies that might help the defense and cybersecurity?
Not that I'm aware of. There's greater and greater encryption that's available, but that's also a problem, right? And going dark is a challenge, right? And we're seeing that. What has been created, the Department of Commerce, through our National Institute of Standards and Technology, we created what we call the Cybersecurity framework for critical infrastructure, but that's now been adopted by most major corporations in the country. And it is the kind of global gold standard for how should an organization address cybersecurity. The problem with the framework is it doesn't apply very well to small businesses. And so we're in fact doing a second iteration that will address things that we've learned over the last 18 months, as well as trying to come up with solutions for smaller businesses, because we're only going to be as strong as our weakest link.
You mentioned twice the encryption issue. Walk us through how you and the Commerce Department, and then you and the administration, because you got to deal with the Justice and Homeland Security Department, deal with something like Michael Bloomberg had his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal yesterday saying Apple is just being unreasonable by insisting on so much end-to-end encryption.
Well, if you step back and you think about the compact that we as Americans have with our government, the deal has never been that we'll have 100% privacy. With a warrant, with a valid warrant, someone can't, the law enforcement can come into your home. They can search something. And we've agreed as American citizens that that is necessary as part of our own security and as part of keeping an orderly society. So the idea that you can just go offline and create spaces that are completely dark is a real challenge for law enforcement. The question is, how do we solve these problems? And that's really where it's a really, really technically hard challenge, because any kind of weakening of encryption, and the administration has taken the position that strong encryption is really critical to the safety and security of our country, so that and for just the reasons that I just said, which is it's not just our defense systems and things like that. We have so much of our critical infrastructure that sits in private sector hands, and we have to protect all of that. Our banks, think of our banks are in the private sector hands. Protecting that is critical. So it is as we sit as the Commerce Department in the debate in the administration, we are sitting with the Department of Justice and the FBI and others who have a strong point of view. We want access at all costs, except that the reality is weakening encryption is not the solution. That creates a whole other set of national security and individual privacy and security vulnerabilities. So this security versus security question is one that we're trying to sort out. And the fundamental thesis we at the Department of Commerce have is we must do that in partnership with the private sector. So the position of a company that they are going to just not participate or take all of that information and make it inaccessible is probably not in the best interest of our country. The question becomes, what is the right path forward? And the president has been trying to figure this out, because it's hard to do legislation. And I think if you leave it to the courts, in both instances, you'll end up with trying to solve a problem that needs a surgical knife with a machete. And that's the unintended consequences are really troublesome when you work through these issues.
You say you have to do it in partnership with the companies like in Silicon Valley. Describe to us a trip that you might take there and what the conversation has ended up being like.
Well, I've sat with a number of CEOs and said to them, look, you've got to put yourself in the position of, how can we work together where you're protecting your customers, but you're also with a valid warrant and a valid process that's gone on. When law enforcement shows up, how do we find ways to cooperate? And there's a lot of cooperation, legal cooperation going on today, but there are places that are inaccessible, and that's where we have to focus our attention.
So do you think, like Apple makes a device that is inaccessible to a court warrant these days?
It's more complicated than that because it's said we won't make it accessible, but obviously the FBI figured out how to get into that device. So, it's a funny world we're living in right now.
Right, but as we feel our way through...
That's not the way we're going to manage
right.
long-term. That's not a systemic solution.
And so?
And so that's what we're working on. I wish I could tell you that we have an easy answer right now. There's not a simple answer.
You talk about the data and data privacy. What initiatives you are doing to make sure I kind of own my data, but we could still have commerce where companies get to use that data in order to have a business model?
Well, there's a real thesis that you should control your own data and opt in versus, who does the company control your data and gets to use it freely? That's a big debate that's going on. I mean, that has not really come to resolution yet. And you're seeing companies and individuals and governments struggling with this. We're seeing it in our engagement. For example, one of the challenges that we're experiencing right now is with the EU, we have had for the last 15 years something called the safe harbor, where data could be sent back and forth between the United States and the EU under a safe harbor agreement, because the EU's privacy regime is different than the United States privacy regime. We do privacy protection in very different ways. And so there needs to be a safe harbor. What's at stake is about $260 billion worth of services and data flows that are supporting $260 billion worth of trade. So it's a big deal to figure this out. So we've negotiated what's called the EU-US Privacy Shield, which is a new form of the safe harbor, and to get this right. And it is trying to update given new technology and given new revelations about how privacy is done in the United States and in the EU. We're trying to reconcile that. There's a huge amount at stake. It's not, whatever solution we come up with, we've also agreed that we have to annually look at it because technology is evolving so quickly that a solution, it's hard to imagine a solution from 15 years ago could apply, right?
Or 15 minutes ago, probably.
Right, and so that's the challenge in this world. And so that's why it's been so important, Walter. What we've done at the department is to say we've got to create several things. We've got to create policy centers of expertise. So that's like our digital economy leadership team, which is a policy center of excellence. We also have in the data world an equivalent group. But the other thing that we've done is we've created public-private partnerships. So we have our digital economy board of advisors, and Zoe Baird and the executive chairman of Mozilla chair that. And we have folks like Brad Smith, who's the president of Microsoft, are on that group. And they're helping us to understand how do we navigate at this intersection of where government and we call it the digital economy. I happen to believe the whole economy is digital. But where these digital issues are meeting up with serious government responsibilities to society and to community. And so we're doing the same as it relates to data, except in the data world, we're primarily focused on how do we make more of our data available. And so we've created something called the Commerce Data Service, which is an internal group of 30 data scientists who are taking on projects to make more and more of our information. I mean, we do everything. We've got weather data, and we've got census data, and we've got income data, and we've got GDP data. We're trying to make all of that more available so it can be used for both better government decisioning as well as better private sector and better individual decisioning.
Getting back, though, to the privacy data and the disputes or differences between Europe and the United States, where Google gets caught in the middle, Explain to me exactly what a safe harbor is and how that works.
Well, the idea is that what are the rules in which companies can transfer certain types of information, and without getting too weedy, because it would get really boring for people.
We're a very weedy crowd.
Yeah, well, at some point this gets not so interesting. But it is, for example, what, they're particularly interested in: what access to what information does the intelligence community have, right? And how much of this data, particularly data about European citizens, could potentially be accessed by our intelligence community. We have now worked out a whole regime as to how that works, as well as greater transparency with them as to what are the safeguards that are in place today around our intelligence community access to data for both American citizens and foreign citizens, which is part of a presidential directive that was issued probably a couple of years ago.
Does the Brexit problem make this harder to deal with?
Well,
or talk about Brexit in general, if you want.
Assuming, Brexit in general, well, assuming that Brexit is ultimately completed, we have to have separate agreements with the UK. As everyone has woken up and realized what Brexit means is not just, campaigning. Now, the UK has got to redefine its relationship with not just the EU, but the EU has relationships with many, many other parts of countries around the world. And those agreements then will no longer apply to the UK, so the UK's got to renegotiate, negotiate those deals. So there's a lot that has to get done, and it's going to be a massive undertaking. Look, the position of the administration is right now, we respect the decision that's been made by, the citizens of the UK. The challenge we face is these are really important allies. Both the UK and the EU are extremely important allies and economic trading partners for the United States. And so, obviously we have a keen interest in how this all sorts itself out. Fortunately, the US economy is in a decent position, but there's no doubt this creates enormous uncertainty, which will have negative effects on global growth, which has effects upon we're not immune to that. People may want to build walls or not kind of be more isolated. But the reality is, we live in a very globalized world, and we can't ignore all of that integration. And so we're going to have to redevelop our new rules of the road with the UK and the EU being separate, and that's a big undertaking. And just renegotiating this safe harbor into the new privacy shield took over 2 years, took the approval of, and I'm hoping, knock on wood, we have the final approval by the 12th of July. But as we've all learned, nothing's over till it's over. But we've negotiated for over 2 years. We had to get the approval of the European Commission, and then we had to get the feedback of the data protection agencies from all of the European countries. And now we need the Article 31 group, which is all the states within Europe, to vote. So many layers of approval for just one agreement. With Brexit, you're going to have many more agreements that have to occur, and it's very complicated at a time when the EU itself is trying to become one more, saying digitally, they're trying to develop a digital single market. That's a huge undertaking in and of itself. So there's a lot. The question I have is, there's a lot to be done with Brexit, and is there enough bandwidth to get it all done?
Well, let me ask that question. What happens if it does go through? Is this a 4, 5, 6 year process of hundreds of people negotiating dozens of agreements on if we're going to have a normalized relationship with the UK? And can that be done easily?
Well, I don't know the time frame it will take. The Article 50, which is the sort of thing that has to be executed that then begins a 2-year process, is at the end of that period, you either have a deal or you have nothing. You're out, right? But, and at the heart of this referendum seems to be the issues around immigration and people movement as much as it is anything. And that issue isn't going away because of Brexit. You're going, if you want to, basically, if you look at Norway, which is not part of the EU, their deal is we allow people movement in exchange for having a benefit of a single market. So that issue of people movement is not going away just because you have Brexit. So can it be done? Of course, deals get negotiated all the time. How long it will take, I don't know. Will it take hundreds of people? Yes. You know, you're going to have to bring all that horsepower to bear on both sides between...
Well, both sides. It'd be the U.S. having to do it with the U.K., assuming there's a U.K., and it having to do it with the EU. So these would be separate negotiations, right?
I presume so, and we have to see. I mean, we have to see kind of how things unfold. We don't really know what the UK government is going to look like right now, right? Whatever assumptions we had 48 hours ago, those were, you know, whatever you read in the newspaper, it changed, right?
Exactly. And you did say a moment ago, assuming Brexit goes through and happens, what are the alternatives that would make it so that Brexit is walked back?
I don't think you can walk back the referendum. And I don't think, you know, the question is, when do they begin the Article 50 process? And
it's inevitable somebody's going to pull that trigger?
Well, I don't know. Now you're getting in over my head. I don't know if there's an alternative to that. That seems to be the assumption as to what will happen. The question is, but there's going to have to be a negotiation because the referendum says, you know, we don't like the deal we have.
And that unhappiness that we don't like things is broader than just Britain. It seems whether it's all over Europe, but especially here in the United States, people feeling upset about the three pillars of globalization, which is free trade, you know, immigration, and this sort of technology globalizing us. What do you do in the Commerce Department going into a digital economy to say to people, you're not going to be left behind? We get hundreds of millions of dollars in prosperity from trade, and we're going to make sure everybody shares in that benefit.
So first, let me step back for a minute. I think that the anger and the angst that we're seeing in Great Britain and seeing here in the United States and seeing in other parts of the world is very much a reflection of this globalization, automation, speed of technological change, and this uncertainty that individuals feel about their personal well-being and their financial well-being and their ability to be constructive members of society. And that is real, and that is serious. And they're looking for solutions. I think that blame is being placed on immigration, trade, et cetera, but I don't think that's placing blame in the right place, because globalization's not going away, and neither is automation, and neither is technological change. So I think that the role of government is to focus on these forces of change and come up with tools to address the impact of those forces of change, and also try and shape those forces of change for the benefit of the individual, for the benefit of communities, for the benefit of businesses. And that's, I think that's the role of government, both local, state, and federal government. And at the federal level, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, to help the individual impacted by trade, we have something called trade adjustment assistance, which is, I think it's hundreds of millions of dollars a year put aside for those who are negatively affected by trade to help with retraining them.
Does that work?
That is a question that has been raised. And is it sufficient? Is it sufficient? And I think there's a lot of people that question whether it's sufficient. I don't think you throw that out. I think that has worked for some, but it's not sufficient, right? So now the question is, and this is part of what we're discussing internally, what else is necessary? And that's an issue that members of Congress have raised with the administration to say, what else could we be doing that's more? Beyond all the workforce training things that we have been doing around apprenticeships, internships, all the efforts that we're working on together on workforce training, and that many people in this room have been doing, greater partnerships with the private sector to help not just people mid-career who are needing to change, but also making sure that our education systems are set up so that a young person has more options in terms of their education and more options to paths into careers. And it's pretty exciting, actually, what's going on, frankly, in the states and in the local communities. I mean, take the state of Colorado. Governor Hickenlooper has been very forward-leaning in this area, and I know he has a partnership with the Markle Foundation that Zoe is working very closely on. But as important is he's also worked to change laws to create incentives for a couple things. First, in schools, it used to be in Colorado that school leaders only got rewarded for the number of kids going to four-year colleges. So there was no incentive to offer alternatives of career technical education to kids in high school. Now you're seeing far more incentive for partnerships so that young people can end a high school with even almost having many credits or certificates that allow them not only to be work ready, but maybe even having earned part of their associate's degree in high school. So they're more work ready earlier in their lives, and they haven't spent the money for a four-year college. So there's much more of that needs to be going on, and we need to elevate and make that more available so that people are ready. They've got digital access, right? That's one of the things we have to focus on. But they're also trained. The jobs today, manufacturing today, if you go into any manufacturing plant, it's a digital job. It is, man working with computers to manage machines. It is, and these are good careers, but you don't necessarily need a certain path, a four-year college path to actually get into these good jobs.
But for a couple of decades, we sort of diminished or demeaned the notion of not going to college, but instead going to trade school, or what we now call CTE. Do we need a mind shift to try to say this is like in Germany, this is a very good path to go in career technical education?
Yeah, I don't think we need to tell kids at 16 you either get to go one direction or another. I think that isn't the mind shift that I think works in America. But I think we have to offer more choices. Another place that's doing it well is Delaware. I mean, they've taken half of their high schools and offered career technical education paths, and it's working very well for their population. So we need to do more of it. And I'm not just talking about going into manufacturing. This is true for going into data jobs, or going into cybersecurity jobs, or going into cloud server, jobs that support the cloud. There's many new and jobs supporting healthcare. There's many ways to get into those careers beyond just a four-year college. I'm not diminishing the importance of four-year college. We need all of the above, and we need to be far bolder about it. And I think that is a part of the solution to addressing this anger and frustration out there. But another part of it is also investing in the government. Federal government should be making significant investments in infrastructure. Those are also alternative careers that are very good, and we need this kind of infrastructure. And the transportation bill that we passed is really, all it does is create several years of certainty at the level that we were at. There's not a big bump in the amount of infrastructure spending that's going on. And those are places where we can help stimulate good jobs, good careers, stimulate the economy, create business opportunity, and begin to address the frustration. Because I think some of this frustration is also austerity. If you look at the UK, they've been under 8 years of austerity, and it hasn't worked. It
Well,
hasn't.
but this was the whole policy for the past 10 or 12 years of, the IMF and everything else is that Greece, England, even the United States had to go on an austerity diet. Was that a mistake?
I don't, whether it was a mistake or not, that I'm not going to opine on that. What's important is here's where we're at. Here's the kind of growth. Our global growth is not where it needs to be, right? You hear many people much smarter about that than I am talk about that. There are things that we can do to stimulate it, but we're out of monetary policy, basically. We have to go to fiscal policy.
Which means investment in infrastructure.
Investment, tax policy, incentives, and things like that. And we should be doing that in the workforce, and we should be investing more.
When you talk about upskilling the workforce, something you worked on even before you became Commerce Secretary with us, what do you mean by that, and what should we be doing to upskill the American workforce?
Well, this is everything that we've been talking about. Upskilling is really, I'll give you an example. There's a program in Houston called Upskill Houston. Houston is the oil and gas sector has declined, like everywhere in our country, because prices have come down. Petrochemical industry has risen in Houston. They need 10,000 petrochemical workers and 75,000 construction workers over the next 5 years to address this opportunity.
So that's a skills gap.
That's a skills gap. So upskilling is retraining someone who's been, doing a fine job in the oil and gas area, but they're no longer needed because of the decline. And offering them, and this is where that whole community, and you and I have been through Aspen Institute and us through the Department of Commerce, are supporting this effort going on in Houston, where we're helping them to put together, and the work is going on locally, but we're studying it to help then replicate best practices. And the point being is that this is an example where the business community came together with the community colleges, the universities, the K through 12 system, and the social service organizations, because some folks, if that oil and gas job goes away, they can't pay their bills and they're in trouble, right? And they're helping bridge them to being retrained for the petrochemical jobs that are, exist and have a demand. This is the kind of, that's retraining, upskilling, that is going to go on more and more in our society, and we owe people a bridge from one to the other, and not just say, oh, sorry, we don't need you anymore in that field, you're out of luck.
You mentioned a moment ago that a person at a factory worker, is more likely to be sitting at a console directing machines how to do things. Do you think that form of automation and robotics will end up decreasing overall the number of jobs, or do you think in the end that adds to productivity and jobs? Well,
that's the $64,000 question. But the reality is that we have greater and greater automation. I had the pleasure of sitting in a steel mill. I went through a steel mill, and I was sitting in the kind of cabin at the man who oversees the kind of overall operations. And he said, I've been a steel worker for 37 years. I said, your job wasn't sitting in front of 6 computers 37 years ago. And he said, no. He said, but I've been retrained so that now I can run the various parts of the operation or oversee them. And there's fewer people on those jobs. That is not going away. And so what we need to be doing is making sure that the training, and it's what we've been talking about, that the education is that we're offering people is relevant to the jobs that are in the future. I mean, we have whole careers that didn't exist 10 years ago. Cybersecurity. Who thought about a career in cybersecurity? Data apps or developing applications. Who thought about that? I mean, there are whole new careers and that are desperately needed that are undermanned because we have not been training for that. And we need to get much greater alignment between what the needs are and what the training is. And
Well,
that's going on state by state, but we need to do more of it.
And city by city in particular, I was reading David Brooks's column this morning, speaking of steel mills in Pittsburgh, and it's about, in some ways, the great resurgence of Pittsburgh, that suddenly there's a whole new economy there based on creativity, but also on better manufacturing. Do you see a resurgence of sort of a startup, entrepreneurial, often urban-based and creative-based economies?
Absolutely, and I see it all over the country. 75% of venture capital today goes to the Silicon Valley, to Boston, and I think New York. That's nuts, right? There are really interesting things happening in places like Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and we're helping to nourish that, if you will, by investing. The Department of Commerce invests in communities called, we help community economic development strategies. We help local communities develop those strategies. We give them money to produce strategies that then, that incorporate, and we require them to incorporate things like, how are you going to nurture your entrepreneurial community? What are you going to do to make sure that you're training the workforce to support the sectors of your economy that you see as growing? So we're trying to get a much greater alliance through helping the development of these strategic plans that are put together by cities and regions. And then another thing that we do is we do fund right into incubators and accelerators. We'll help them build the buildings we can do through our public works grants. And so that's happening in Tennessee, I've been in Tennessee, in Louisiana, in Ohio. I mean, it's not all just happening in, the 2 or 3 locations that are globally well known. And we need to build on that. The other thing we need to do is these advanced manufacturing institutes that the president has initiated. We have about 10 or 15 of them now. I think we'll have 15 by the end of the administration, is another place we have to invest, which is in innovation. 1/3 to 1/2 of our growth is in innovation. So you take Youngstown, Ohio, which was the first, they're called NNMI, National Network of Manufacturing Innovation, but forget the Washington acronym. It's an advanced manufacturing institute. It's a partnership between local universities, businesses, small and large, and the federal government and the workforce system to take that one. In general, the program is about taking cutting-edge technologies from lab to market. That one is on 3D printing. It's been in existence over 3 years. What do we see? We see GE investing. We see small and businesses investing in that area. And there's going to be a real hub of 3D printing. One of the things we're doing, because we run the network at the Department of Commerce of all the different advanced manufacturing institutes. Now you're seeing partnerships in places like El Paso and other places. So you're seeing this blossoming of innovation, but also new investment, new job creation around what was a $70 million federal investment. It wasn't that much money, and it was matched initially 1-to-1. Had 60 companies and academic institutions and workforce organizations. Today, there's over 120 participating. Today, that match has been multiples of the federal dollars put up. And you've got a whole ecosystem that's up and charged.
What Steve Case calls the rise of the rest.
Exactly.
You just see it blooming.
We need to do much more of that, and we need to do it all over the country.
Let me open it up, if I may. Jane Harmon, and then...
Hello there. Oh, we did call someone.
I'll point out the people, and you bring the microphone to them if you would, please. Thank you.
Penny, you do a fabulous job. Many of us, I am Jane Harmon, right? I thought Walter said that. Many of us in this audience think that trade is a jobs multiplier, and I know you do. And I know that this administration is strongly in favor of TPP. What chance do you think there is of getting it passed by Congress even in the lame duck session, notwithstanding the tepid to negative views of the candidates for president? And if there is a chance, what help do you need from the rest of us in the audience?
So I think there's a definite chance of getting this done. I'm not going to put a percentage on it, but I will say the following. You have a president, a speaker, and a leader who all are pro-trade. And you have a time in this country where American leadership globally is absolutely essential. I mean, when you've got this, situation going on in Europe, where you've got the whole world watching to see whether the United States can pull off the kind of multilateral engagement, this deal is as important for its economic benefits as it is for its national security and for American leadership. And there's a recognition of that. The counting noses, I think we can put the votes together. I think that we're resolving a couple of issues that have arisen since the documents were completed. Most of those are being resolved. The help that we need is, and I think this is a great opportunity for America, it's a renegotiation of NAFTA, it elevates our standards, it's got great opportunity for our American workforce. Because of the kind of standards. It's got great opportunity for our digital economy in it. But the help we need is, you got to be heard. If you're in favor of this, you can't sit back and say, oh, well, there's a lot of negative talk and I'm not going to be involved. So we've got the leadership of dozens and dozens and dozens of major companies, large companies, who are working with their employees to explain to their employees the benefits that they're for them as individual citizens of these deals, not just for the business, but for the individual working in that business and what the opportunity that gets created by that. We need more company leaders doing that. We need more op-eds. We need your voices heard, by the folks who are going to take votes. And if you want to us to support that effort and give you a roadmap of things to do, please call me, email me, grab me walking out of here. I mean, we have a very robust effort working with the business leadership in not just manufacturing, but in the tech community, and there are so many benefits in this deal for American workers and American companies. But we've got to, be aggressive about it, or it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, back there, yeah.
My name is Mackenzie, and I'm here with my father from Phoenix. I just wanted to ask a question related to this upcoming November. Seems like what you've been doing, certainly within the department in the last 3 years, is incredible. There's a lot of movement, a lot of things that I heard as a young American that are very exciting. What ways do you feel like your department would be able to ensure progress should we have a Republican leader who becomes president in November?
Well, look, transitions in government are going to happen. How it's going to transition is not something I'm going to prognosticate or get into or comment on anyone's campaign. What I'll tell you what we're doing at the department is we're working to make sure that we institutionalize the things like a digital economy leadership team so that our country has the kind of policy expertise it needs. These issues aren't going away because of an election. They're just going to need, you're going to need more professionals, available to do these things. We're working, for example, to put digital attachés in our embassies around the world. These are folks who are experts in the digital economy who can help American companies who want to sell their goods and services around the world. We're growing our foreign commercial service to help make sure that companies of all sorts can have greater access to markets. We continue to work with, I'll go to India in August. We continue to work with our largest trading partners, India, China, Europe, et cetera, on addressing trade barriers. The thing to remember is, and this is something that I found in this, that we can't forget, the Department of Commerce is 45,000, 47,000 people, somewhere in that range, depending on the ups and downs. in different departments and different agencies in the department. 169 of us are political appointees. Everybody else is working there. That's their career. That's what they're doing as their professional engagement. And so part of our job as the political leadership is to help those folks to appreciate the benefits of their work so that they carry it forward with the kind of energy and robust excitement that we as politicals are, brought in to do. And so that's been actually one of my favorite parts of the job, is really energizing the folks who work in the department to carry forward, different initiatives that we have, and we've got a lot of them going on.
Just between us, that whole big department, what's the most fun? The Weather Service? Oceans? What do you like to hang out with?
I love all my children equally.
No. All right. Questions? Right there. Oh, hey, yeah.
Hi, my name's Madison.
Madison Warner,
Uh-huh.
Senator's daughter.
Uh-huh. Hello.
I was wondering, returning to what you started with at the beginning about cybersecurity and privacy, I just wanted your perspective on kind of the confluence of security versus privacy in our modern age, and how there's kind of a sanctification of privacy as being this ultimate need to be protected, and how that crosses over with security in terms of law enforcement and encryption. Do you think there's a way to make clear the distinction between what is private and whether that's a right or whether security is a right for the American people?
Thank you, Madison. Yeah.
Well, the reality is, Matt, that we have to balance both, right? And as I said at the beginning, this is, there's not privacy at all costs. We don't have a society that's not the American society that we live in. And so that's why this issue is so challenging, and today, what you're seeing is people voluntarily giving up their privacy to get services, right, that they want. I want Google. You're giving up a certain amount of privacy. They are following you around in your digital travels. And so that is, that is what's important there, is to make sure people understand what trade-offs they're making. And that's a part where I don't think, how many of us, click agree or, accept the terms, and how many of us have actually read all of that language, right? Probably
Zero.
Not many in this room. I certainly have done that quite often. And so the question is really going to be one of ultimately us figuring out where are those lines, and does there need to be some regulation around it or not? And we're kind of in the Wild West of all of this right now.
Mm-hmm. Bob.
Working. Hi, I'm Bob Dickey from Boston. Great to be here, and thank you so much for being here and for your comments.
Thank you.
Our question is this. I had dinner a month or so ago with a friend in the pharmaceutical industry who said that we're doing, in the U.S., zero research now on antibiotics, which should scare all of us. The reason is that the Chinese and Indians have been knocking off products when they're finally developed, and it's very expensive to develop an effective and safe pharmaceutical product. And with the potential outbreak, it's happening already, of super viruses, super bacteria, this I think is alarming. Which brings up the question, now I know that the Department of Justice and perhaps other branches of government deal with intellectual property and piracy and the like. Do you have any comments on that as to where we stand and what's being done and what might be done in the future?
So these are issues, intellectual property protection is a big issue for the Department of Commerce as well as the Department of Justice. It's not one that we just leave to other departments. We have the Patent and Trademark Office as part of the Department of Commerce. So we work constantly on this issue with our peers in India, in China, and around the world in terms of trying to raise intellectual property protection standards so that this kind of piracy that's going on, which has gone from, it used to be just movies and music and things like that, has moved to very complicated theft of serious, either, it's everything from chemicals and pharmaceuticals to other types of trade secrets, if you will. It's a big issue that we are constantly working with other governments on. In the medical area, we did make some progress at the JCCT, which is a meeting that the Commerce Department and the U.S. Trade Rep lead with the Chinese. Last December, we made some progress on this whole issue of pharmaceutical protections and processes. The president, during President Obama, in the meeting with President Xi, in advance of that meeting, there were agreements about intellectual property theft and about taking of intellectual secrets for commercial purposes. That is a big challenge that we face, and this is part of the cybersecurity issues that we're trying to address, because it's all sitting on digital files now.
We're out of time almost, but I want to do the last big question, which is we're seeing an enormous backlash against globalism and trade, whether we like it or not. How bad is it for this world if we regress and start putting up tariffs and barriers again?
I think it's the wrong solution for the problem. And, the world is to withdraw from the global markets is to ignore the fact that the United States is only 5% of the world's market. It's to ignore that we have goods and services. If you don't think there will be retribution for that, you're kidding yourself. And so we need to, I think that's not the prescription or solution for the challenges. I think it's the things that we've talked about. It's investment, it's investing in our people first, as well as our infrastructure. It's investing in good policies. It's the government making sure that the education pathways for our young and mid-career folks are fluid enough to keep up with this change.
Secretary Pritzker, thanks for being back here. See you next year. Thank you.
Thank you.